In the early spring of 1241, across the cold plains of Central Europe, an army was already moving west that many believed did not exist. Reports had arrived for months. Fragments of rumor carried by merchants, terrified refugees, and battered messengers from the east. Cities burned beyond the Carpathian Mountains. Entire regions of the Kingdom of Hungary were collapsing. Armies that should have resisted had simply vanished. But in Poland, many still struggled to believe the scale of the threat. Europe had faced invasions before. Steppe raiders had crossed these lands for centuries, Pecheneg, Cumans, and earlier nomadic tribes whose sudden cavalry strikes were terrifying but ultimately temporary. These raids burned villages, took captives, and disappeared again into the eastern horizon. What was coming in 1241 was something entirely different. Behind the eastern mountains, the Mongol Empire had already reshaped half the known world. In just a few decades, the armies created by Genghis Khan had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, shattered the military power of Central Asia, and pushed westward through the lands of the Rus. Cities that had stood for centuries, Ryazan, Vladimir, Kiev, had been reduced to charred ruins. Entire populations were wiped out or scattered. But the Mongols did not simply conquer. They studied. Every invasion was a calculated process. Scouts traveled months ahead of armies. Trade routes became intelligence networks. Prisoners were interrogated about roads, rivers, fortifications, and local politics. By the time Mongol armies arrived at a battlefield, they already understood the terrain, the enemy's weaknesses, and often the internal divisions of the societies they were about to destroy. Europe, however, did not yet understand this. In the winter of 1240 to 1241, the Mongol command structure began preparing a massive western campaign. The invasion would strike multiple fronts simultaneously, overwhelming resistance before neighboring kingdoms could unite. The primary invasion force was aimed south, toward Hungary. But another army, smaller, faster, and designed specifically for disruption, would sweep into Poland. Its mission was not merely conquest. Its mission was isolation. The Mongol generals understood that if Polish forces could unite with the Hungarian armies or receive reinforcements from the German states, resistance might become far more dangerous. So the Mongol army entering Poland had a different objective: destroy any coalition before it could form. The man leading this force was Baidar, a seasoned commander who had fought in the campaigns across Russia. With him rode other experienced generals, men who had spent years perfecting the mobile warfare that defined Mongol strategy. Their army was not enormous by medieval standards. Estimates vary, but most historians believe the Mongol contingent moving into Poland numbered between 20,000 and 30,000 cavalry. But these were not ordinary soldiers. Every warrior was mounted. Every unit could travel enormous distances in a matter of days. Each soldier carried multiple horses, allowing the army to maintain relentless speed across vast terrain. More importantly, they fought according to a system Europe had never encountered before. The Mongol military was not organized around noble commanders and feudal levies. It operated through a strict decimal structure. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Commanders were selected for ability, discipline, and loyalty rather than noble birth. Orders traveled rapidly through signal flags, horns, and coordinated maneuvers practiced repeatedly during campaigns. To European observers, Mongol warfare often appeared chaotic. Waves of riders advancing, retreating, scattering across open land. But the chaos was deliberate. It was a carefully constructed battlefield illusion. As the Mongol army crossed into Poland in early 1241, they moved with terrifying speed. First came reconnaissance units. Light cavalry rode ahead, mapping river crossings, identifying roads, and observing the movement of Polish forces. Behind them came larger formations striking towns and fortified settlements. Cities like Sandomierz were attacked with sudden precision. Walls that should have resisted were bypassed through deception or overwhelmed by siege tactics the Mongols had learned during earlier wars in China and Central Asia. But the Mongols were not lingering to hold territory. They were drawing Polish forces outward. News of the destruction spread rapidly across the fragmented Polish duchies. Nobles and local rulers scrambled to assemble defensive forces. Poland in the 13th century was not a unified kingdom in the modern sense. Authority was divided among regional dukes who governed semi-independent territories. Coordination between them was often slow and uncertain. But one man began taking control of the crisis. Henry II the Pious, Duke of Silesia. Henry was one of the most powerful princes in Poland at the time. His territories were strategically located near the frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, and he maintained connections with German military orders and neighboring rulers. Unlike many nobles who initially dismissed the Mongol threat as exaggerated frontier panic, Henry quickly realized the danger. Refugees arriving from the east described entire armies destroyed in open battle. Cities burned to the ground. Cavalry forces that seemed to appear and vanish across the landscape with unnatural speed. The pattern was disturbing, and the Mongols were moving closer. Henry began gathering forces across Silesia and neighboring territories. Messengers were sent to Polish dukes, German knights, and military orders such as the Teutonic Knights and Knights Templar, requesting reinforcements. What assembled in response was not a massive army by continental standards, but it represented one of the most serious defensive efforts Poland could field under the circumstances. Estimates suggest Henry eventually gathered between 15,000 and 25,000 soldiers. The core of this force consisted of heavily armored Polish knights, elite cavalry trained in shock combat. Alongside them were infantry levies from Silesian towns, mercenary soldiers, and small contingents of foreign knights who had joined the defense. To European military tradition, these knights represented the most powerful battlefield force available. Armored cavalry charges had dominated medieval warfare for centuries.
When properly organized and delivered with momentum, a line of charging knights could shatter infantry formations and crush lighter cavalry. Against most enemies, it was devastating. But the Mongols had spent decades studying and defeating exactly this kind of army. As Henry's forces gathered near the town of Legnica in southwestern Poland, Mongol reconnaissance units were already observing them from a distance. They counted banners. They measured marching speed. They noted how the European army formed its lines and how its commanders communicated. More importantly, the Mongols were already shaping the battlefield before the Polish knights even realized a battle was coming. Small Mongol detachments continued raiding nearby regions, drawing parts of the Polish coalition away from Legnica. Confusion spread among local commanders about the true location and size of the Mongol force. Some believed the main Mongol army was still far to the east. Others thought the raiders were only scattered units operating independently. But in reality, Badar's army was concentrating quietly. By early April 1241, Mongol cavalry units were moving into position around Legnica. They did not approach the town in one visible column. Instead, they arrived gradually, spreading across the surrounding countryside, hidden beyond hills, forests, and river crossings. The battlefield that would soon decide the fate of the Polish army was already taking shape. But the European commanders did not yet understand the nature of the enemy they were about to face. For them, the coming battle would be fought according to familiar logic of medieval warfare. Two armies would meet, knights would charge. The stronger force would break the weaker one. But for the Mongol generals observing from the distance, the battle had already entered its most important phase. Not the clash of steel, but the shaping of expectation. Because Mongol warfare was never simply about defeating an army. It was about convincing that army to destroy itself. And on the plains near Legnica, that process had already begun. By the morning of April 9, 1241, the plains outside the small Silesian town of Legnica had become the stage for a confrontation neither side fully understood. The land itself was not dramatic. Low, rolling fields stretched outward from the town, broken only by scattered woods, marshy ground near streams, and narrow farm roads cutting through early spring grass. The soil was still damp from winter thaw. Patches of fog lingered in shallow depressions during the early hours of the day. To the European commanders gathering their forces, the terrain appeared suitable for the kind of battle they knew best. Open ground meant room for cavalry, room for momentum, room for the disciplined violence of a knightly charge. Duke Henry II had positioned his army carefully. He needed space to deploy his heavy cavalry, but also a defensible position if the battle turned against them. The town of Legnica itself sat behind the Polish lines, offering a point of retreat if necessary. The army formed up outside its walls, facing eastward toward where Mongol forces had last been reported. Henry's army was a mixture of professional knights, regional levies, and allied troops drawn together in urgency rather than long preparation. At the center of his formation stood the heavy cavalry. Polish and Silesian knights assembled under banners that marked noble houses and regional lords. Their armor reflected the wealth and martial traditions of medieval Europe. Mail hauberks reinforced with metal plates, conical helmets, kite-shaped shields, and long lances designed for devastating mounted charges. Many knights rode powerful war horses bred for shock combat. These animals were large, trained to endure the chaos of battle, and armored in protective barding when available. Behind and around the cavalry stood infantry units, spearmen, crossbowmen, and town militias equipped with simpler weapons. Their role was to support the cavalry and hold ground if enemy forces attempted to flank. Among the Allied contingents were foreign fighters. German knights from nearby territories had joined the defense, bringing experience from border conflicts within the Holy Roman Empire. Some chroniclers also mention small groups connected to military orders, though the exact numbers remain debated among historians. What mattered most was that Henry had assembled a force capable, at least in theory, of confronting the Mongols in open battle. Across the fields to the east, the Mongol army was forming its own lines, but their deployment looked very different. Instead of dense formations or visible ranks of armored soldiers, the Mongol presence appeared scattered. Groups of horsemen rode in loose clusters, their movements fluid and difficult to read. Many wore lighter armor than the European knights, lamellar plates or hardened leather designed for mobility rather than heavy protection. Their primary weapons were composite bows capable of tremendous power, even when fired from horseback. Each Mongol rider carried several types of arrows, armor-piercing heads for heavily protected targets, wider blades for unarmored soldiers and horses. Unlike European cavalry, Mongol warriors did not rely primarily on shock charges. Their battlefield strength came from distance, movement, precision, and coordination across enormous space. As the sun climbed higher over the plains, the two armies began closing the distance. From the Polish perspective, the Mongol deployment looked strangely uncertain. Instead of advancing in a single mass, Mongol cavalry units moved forward cautiously, probing the edges of the battlefield. Small groups approached, fired arrows from a distance, then retreated before Polish knights could reach them. This was familiar behavior for steppe raiders. European commanders had seen similar tactics before. Nomadic cavalry often harassed enemy lines with arrows before attempting to withdraw if confronted by heavier troops. To many observers within Henry's army, the Mongol riders appeared cautious, perhaps even hesitant. But this interpretation was exactly what Mongol commanders intended, because the opening phase of the battle was not about defeating the Polish army directly. It was about controlling its reactions. The first significant clash began when forward elements of the Polish line moved to engage the Mongol skirmishers. Infantry units and lighter cavalry advanced cautiously, attempting to drive away the Mongol riders who were peppering the formation with arrows. The Mongols responded with the same pattern. Advance, loose arrows, retreat. From a distance, the battlefield looked like a series of small, disconnected encounters. Dust clouds formed where horses galloped across dry patches of ground. Arrows flashed through the air before disappearing into shields and armor. To many European soldiers watching from behind the lines, the Mongol army appeared disorganized. But beneath the surface, Mongol commanders were measuring something extremely important: the discipline of the Polish army, and how quickly its knights would abandon formation in pursuit of an enemy. Eventually, that moment arrived. At the front of the Polish line, a group of knights launched a sudden cavalry charge against the nearest Mongol riders. Lances lowered, horses surged forward, closing the distance rapidly. The Mongol skirmishers turned and fled. To the charging knights, this appeared to be the beginning of a rout. They pressed forward harder, spurring their horses across the field. But as the distance widened between these knights and the main Polish formation, Mongol riders began executing the maneuver they had perfected across countless campaigns, the feigned retreat. Mongol cavalry withdrew rapidly but in controlled formations, maintaining just enough distance to stay ahead of the pursuing knights. Behind them, hidden beyond small rises in the terrain and patches of woodland, other Mongol units were already maneuvering. Signals traveled through horns and flags. Entire wings of cavalry began moving across the battlefield in wide arcs. Meanwhile, the pursuing knights continued forward, convinced they were chasing a collapsing enemy. Their horses thundered across the fields, armor clattering with every stride. The ground shook beneath the weight of war horses, accelerating into what seemed like victory. But what the knights could not see was how far they had already been drawn from their own lines. Back near the original Polish position, confusion was beginning to spread. Dust clouds obscured visibility. Mongol riders were appearing at unexpected angles, firing arrows into the edges of the formation before disappearing again. Infantry units struggled to track the movement of an enemy that never remained still. Then something even more unsettling began to happen. Thick smoke suddenly drifted across portions of the battlefield. Mongol units had begun deploying smoke screens, likely created from burning materials carried specifically for this purpose. The wind carried the smoke directly towards sections of the Polish line, reducing visibility even further. In the chaos, communication between units became difficult. Orders shouted across the battlefield were swallowed by distance and confusion. And somewhere ahead of the advancing knights, the Mongol retreat was beginning to slow, because the trap had almost fully formed. Across the plains of Legnica, Mongol cavalry units were now converging from multiple directions. The knights who had charged forward believed they were pursuing a fleeing enemy. In reality, they were riding directly into the center of a carefully prepared killing ground. And behind them, the rest of the Polish army was slowly losing the ability to see or understand what was happening. The battle had finally begun in earnest, but the momentum of the field was already shifting, not through brute force, but through movement, through deception, and through the quiet discipline of an army that had spent decades learning exactly how to dismantle opponents who believed victory was only one charge away. The turning point at Legnica did not arrive with a sudden shock. It emerged gradually, almost invisibly, through the slow unraveling of control. Far ahead of the Polish main formation, the knights who had launched the initial pursuit were already riding deep into the Mongol trap. Their horses, powerful but heavy, had been driven hard across the fields in a charge meant to break an enemy line. But there was no enemy line. Instead, Mongol cavalry continued to withdraw in carefully measured distances, always just beyond the reach of lances. The European knights believed they were chasing a defeated foe. In reality, they were being separated from their army. As the distance widened, Mongol commanders began tightening the circle. From both flanks, previously hidden cavalry units moved inward at speed. Riders appeared across the ridgelines and through thin woodland patches that bordered the open plain. What had once looked like scattered skirmishers were now forming deliberate arcs around the pursuing knights. Then the arrows began to fall in earnest. Composite bows, drawn from horseback with practiced precision, sent volleys of armor-piercing arrows toward the isolated cavalry. Mongol archers rode in wide circles, releasing shots while constantly repositioning to remain out of reach. The European knights attempted to respond in the only way they knew. They charged again, but each charge met the same result. Mongol riders withdrew before contact, spreading outward while continuing to fire arrows into horses and expose gaps in armor. The tactic had been refined over decades of warfare. Instead of confronting the strength of armored cavalry directly, the Mongols targeted its weaknesses: mobility, coordination, and endurance. War horses, large and powerful but vulnerable, became the primary targets. An injured horse collapsing beneath its rider created immediate chaos. Knights thrown to the ground struggled to regain footing, while arrows continued to fall around them. Armor that protected against swords and lances offered far less security against repeated arrow strikes at range. Within minutes, the pursuing cavalry began to fragment. Some knights attempted to regroup. Others tried to withdraw toward the main Polish line. But the Mongol encirclement was already closing. Back near the original battlefield position, Duke Henry II and the remaining Polish forces were confronting a different kind of crisis. Visibility across the field had deteriorated significantly. Smoke drifted across sections of the battlefield, carried by the wind in shifting patterns. Dust clouds thrown up by galloping horses further obscured the view. Messengers attempting to carry orders between units struggled to navigate the confusion. From the Polish perspective, the battle was becoming increasingly difficult to interpret. Forward units had disappeared into distant dust clouds. Mongol riders continued harassing the edges of the formation with arrows, appearing suddenly before vanishing again. And then reports began arriving that the knights who had charged earlier were under heavy attack. Henry faced a brutal decision. If he committed the remainder of his cavalry to reinforce them, he risked weakening the main defensive line. If he held position, those knights would likely be destroyed. The pressure of the moment forced action. Additional Polish cavalry units were sent forward in an attempt to break through the Mongol formations and relieve the trapped knights. But the Mongols had anticipated this response. As new cavalry units advanced from the Polish line, Mongol forces shifted again, opening temporary gaps that appeared vulnerable. European knights surged forward into these openings. Then the gaps closed behind them. Arrows rained down from multiple directions, and the battlefield began to fracture completely. What had started as a single organized army was now breaking into isolated pockets of fighting across the plain. Groups of knights fought surrounded by fast-moving Mongol cavalry. Infantry units, lacking the mobility of mounted troops, struggled to reposition or support their commanders. The Mongol strategy was working exactly as intended. Rather than destroying the Polish army through one decisive collision, they were dismantling it piece by piece. Each separated group became an individual battlefield. Each unit faced an enemy that refused to stand still long enough to be struck. Some Polish knights attempted desperate countercharges, hoping to punch through Mongol lines and escape the encirclement. But the Mongol riders simply widened their circles, continuing to fire arrows while maintaining distance. Gradually, exhaustion began to take hold. European war horses were not bred for endless maneuver warfare. They had been trained for short bursts of devastating force. After prolonged pursuit and repeated charges, many were already weakening. The Mongol horses, smaller but far more enduring, maintained their relentless pace. As hours passed, the Polish resistance began collapsing entirely. Units that attempted retreat discovered Mongol cavalry already positioned along potential escape routes. Others fought where they stood until arrows and exhaustion reduced their ability to continue. Some soldiers attempted to flee toward the safety of Legnica's walls. Few reached them. Duke Henry II himself remained in the field as long as possible, attempting to reorganize the shattered remnants of his army. But the situation had already passed a point where leadership alone could restore order. At some stage during the chaos, likely during the final phases of the encirclement, Henry was killed. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Chroniclers later described his body being identified by distinctive physical marks after the battle. His death marked the final collapse of coordinated resistance. By late afternoon, the battlefield had become a landscape of scattered survivors, fallen horses, and Mongol riders moving methodically among the remains of the Polish army. The Mongols had not merely defeated their opponent. They had erased it as a coherent fighting force. Estimates of Polish casualties vary widely among historical sources, but it is clear that a significant portion of the army assembled by Henry II was destroyed that day. For the Mongols, however, Legnica was never intended to be a territorial conquest. It was part of a larger strategic design. While Badar's forces were dismantling the Polish coalition in Silesia, the main Mongol armies were pushing deeper into Hungary, where an even larger European force awaited them. The purpose of the Polish campaign had been achieved. No relief army from Poland or the German states would arrive in time to support Hungary. Within days of the battle, Mongol forces withdrew from the Legnica region, continuing their movements southward in coordination with the larger invasion. For the people of Europe, however, the shock of Legnica was profound. The battle revealed something deeply unsettling about the nature of Mongol warfare. Traditional European military logic, based on armor, noble leadership, and decisive charges, had been completely outmaneuvered. The Mongols had demonstrated that discipline, speed, intelligence gathering, and psychological manipulation could dismantle even the most prestigious knightly forces of medieval Europe. The battle also spread fear far beyond Poland. News of the defeat traveled westward through the Holy Roman Empire. Rumors described unstoppable horsemen, armies that appeared and vanished, and tactics that seemed almost impossible to counter. For a brief moment in 1241, it appeared that the Mongol advance into Europe might continue indefinitely. But history would take an unexpected turn. Later that same year, news arrived from the east that Ogedai Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire, had died. According to Mongol political tradition, major princes were required to return east to participate in the election of a new great Khan. The western campaigns were halted. The Mongol armies withdrew. Europe had not defeated the invasion. It had simply survived it. Yet the memory of Legnica endured. It became a symbol of a moment when two radically different systems of warfare collided on the plains of Central Europe. One built on centuries of knightly tradition, the other forged through relentless adaptation across the vast steppe. And on that April day in 1241, the difference between them had become devastatingly clear.